Boldwood presents The X, written by Diane Saxon and read by Katie Sobey. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Saturday, the 10th of July, 23:25 hours. Emily Shenton punched open the door to the deserted ladies' room with the heel of her hand and stormed inside before it rebounded off the wall and slammed shut behind her. The emptiness inside still failed to block out the rhythmic thud of music and only dimmed the laughter and conversation of over 80 people at the company's summer ball. She hated them. Every single one of them. The gossip mongers who couldn't wait to spread their vileness under the guise of good wishes and happy vibes. When they knew. They all knew. Temper spilled from her, a fetid pus spreading from the core of her in a boiling, seething mass. She tipped her head back and drank straight from the bottle full of rosé she'd swiped from a deserted table on her way past. No one would notice. No one would care. She'd no idea why the company insisted on paying for so much wine, red, white and rosé, when most of the men wanted beer, for God's sake. The women preferred red or Prosecco, and the rosé was left for the waiters to sweep away at the end of the night. Lucky bloody waiters. She stepped into the oversized disabled cubicle and balled up the skirt of her black gown with one hand as she slapped her back against the chill of the wall and slid down until her backside met the floor. Sweat slicked the back of her knees as she pressed them flat to the floor tiles to absorb every bit of coolness. Heat pulsed through her chest and up her neck as she tore into the fine organza material of the overskirt, ripping weak nails until they were jagged. Tears burnt the back of her eyes as she ground her teeth and took another slug of wine. She wished she'd never come. Wished she'd never overheard it. That's why she avoided these functions like the plague. She hated the gossip, preferred to keep to herself and block out the voices. But she'd felt good. Strong. So strong, she'd decided not to take her medication. Again. Tears filled her eyes and washed over her vision. It wasn't lack of medication that had her temper surging. It was the damned infernal gossip. Bastards. Why couldn't they keep their mouths shut? They had to know she'd been stood on the edge of the circle when Chris Whittington raised his glass and hee-hawed like the ass he was as he brayed his drunken words. "Here's to Zach Cheetham-Epstein and his new wife, Imelda." Nausea clawed the back of her throat. How was it so many of them knew Zach, had evidently kept in contact? Zach, the love of her life, the only man she'd truly loved. There'd been others before him, of course there had, but they'd faded into insignificance in the heat of her adoration for Zach. The bottle clinked as she placed it on the tiled floor at her side. She covered her face with her hands. A helpless moan slipped from her lips as the familiar hissing sound swirled around her head. "For God's sake!" She tried to push it back, but it was insistent. The sound of a seashell shushing, filling her mind so she could no longer concentrate. She rolled her head from side to side, her hot, florid face couched in the palms of her sweaty hands. She'd never forgive him for leaving. Leaving the company. Leaving her. But she knew he still loved her. He had to. Memories nudged in with cruel disregard, and she raised her head to stare through the open door of the cubicle at the row of white porcelain sinks in front of the glare of oversized mirrors. She'd caught him flirting with the girl in accounts, the skinny, emaciated little bitch with too much makeup and those tattooed eyebrows. The girl hadn't stayed at the firm long, not after it emerged she had a night job as a topless waitress servicing private parties. It wasn't difficult to gather information on anyone. Facebook was the go-to stalking site. It was even easier to get that information into the public domain where assumptions were jumped to, judgments made. Zack had taken umbrage, said she was unreasonable. She'd lost her mind. Insisted she move out when she'd only just moved in. He hadn't meant it, of course. His mother had influenced him. Emily knew the woman didn't like her. The feeling was mutual. There was no denying Zack and Emily loved each other. He was her soulmate, her destiny. Convinced of it, she'd told him enough times. Begged, pleaded. Even after he announced he'd found a new job and put his notice in, she'd continued to try and persuade him, right up until he left the company, claiming every holiday owed to him instead of taking them in lieu. Almost 2 years ago. She wanted to give him space back then, but he'd consumed her mind. She'd checked the HR records under the pension scheme for his new address when he moved out of the flat they'd shared together. Started to set up home together. The one he'd already made her leave. Their little love nest he'd broken apart with the help of his mother. Emily had driven past the 3-story Victorian house he'd purchased since he'd left the company. Not something she'd have chosen for their lives together, but confident he'd change his mind, she waited. There would be time enough to persuade him to sell the place, once they were together again. She just needed to give him some space. Space he needed to realise how much he missed her, how much he loved her. She gave him the space, resisted contacting him, but she couldn't let go altogether. She couldn't help driving past his house again and again, in the hope she'd catch a glimpse of him. So many times, until she'd made herself sick. Wanda had made her better. Wanda Stilgo, her counsellor, assigned to her when she had her meltdown a few months after Zack had gone, when the obsession had taken hold and wouldn't let go. Wanda, the only person who never treated her with disapproval or judgment. But Wanda had been gone for 3 weeks now, and wouldn't be coming back. Nor had Emily been assigned another counsellor yet. They were in no hurry, under pressure and short-staffed. She was better, they said. They believed she was better, so she must be. They spoke once a week to her, reassured her it wouldn't be long until they found someone suitable to talk to. Emily ground her teeth as she dug her fingers deep into her scalp and wrenched at the perfect coiffure of teased curls tumbling from where they'd been piled on top of her head by Teresa at A-Head. She'd spent good money and time on the hairstyle to make certain it looked the very best of casual elegance. Teresa had accomplished that. With a pained yowl, Emily yanked the pins out and hurled them across the stained floor of the ladies' room of the top-notch hotel the company had held their summer ball at for the past 5 years. No originality or thought around the whole concept of the idea of the ball. A reward, an acknowledgement of the tough work, blood, sweat and tears that went into every day of hard slog. And it was a slog. She hated her job. She hated the people. Except for Zack. She loved him with her entire being. But he'd been gone for so long, and nothing had been the same since. There was an emptiness in her world, a vacuum of nothingness. Emily flopped her head down onto her hands and let the anger vibrate from the pit of her stomach until it flowed from her tightened throat in a feral growl. No longer empty, but overflowing with fury. A fury she'd not experienced for so long. Not since the medication had flattened everything until she no longer lived, simply existed. What the hell had happened? Where did it go wrong? She thought she had it in hand, the whole situation. Convinced to stay away, she'd not driven past his house in more than a year, possibly longer. The days had all merged into a foggy passage of time she'd lost a grip on, no longer cared about, while the medication lulled her, and her counsellor reassured her. Wanda had persuaded her not to check on him. She'd said it would only make Emily sick again. Wanda, her counsellor, her saviour. Emily reached for the bottle of wine and took a good, healthy swig before she slapped it back down on the floor again. She tipped her head back and let the mouthful of liquid wash the dryness in her throat away as she let out a little moan. Wanda wasn't there anymore to keep the demons away, and now they came crowding back in, elbowing their way into her mind, like they did before Wanda, only louder and more voracious, as though the volume had been turned up. The tears that threatened washed across her vision and made the overbright lights in the ladies' room dance and sway. It was a lifetime since she'd seen her beautiful, black-haired, violet-eyed Welshman. She'd believed he'd be back when he was ready. She'd thought he'd return to her. Wanda hadn't been privy to that thought. If she'd known, she'd have tried to persuade Emily otherwise, so Emily had kept it to herself. Nurtured it. Sure, if she let him have his time, sow his wild oats, he'd realise how much he missed her and come back. He needed to grow up, be ready to settle down. Well, he had grown up. He had settled down. Just not with her. Emily rolled her head from side to side against the wall, the last of the pins grinding against her scalp. Too late. I left it too late. As pain consumed her, she brought her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them as she rocked. Rocked to comfort herself. Rocked to lessen the ache burning in her chest as her heart threatened to explode. She tucked her tear-drenched face into her knees and stilled. In the silence, the voice she'd ignored for so long whispered its dark thoughts in her ear. Go away. Go away. You're not allowed here. She scrunched her eyes closed and slapped her hands over her ears. You're banned. Wanda said I'm not to allow you in, not to listen to you. But Wanda wasn't there to push it back, and the voice didn't listen. It murmured sweet, sweet encouragement with sly insistence. Hello? Are you okay in there? From her sanctuary on the cool, tiled floor of the toilet, Emily reared her head back and kicked the stool door closed with the flat brogues no one could see under her ball gown. Spitting, spewing fury burst from her lips as she stared at the closed door. On the other side, the woman she barely knew from accounts, who'd dared to disturb her, whispered to someone else, Do you think she's all right? Fuck off! Shocked silence followed a sharp intake of breath. I'm sorry. The click of the woman's thin heels tip-tapped on the tiled floor. I said, fuck off. The voice enunciated it clearly, in case the woman was under any illusion that she required her assistance. The deep gravel of it grated through Emily's throat as it burst out, tearing her lips back from her teeth so the feral snarl flung white frothy spittle to spray over her naked knees. A horrified gasp came from the woman on the other side of the cubicle, who fled, leaving the outer door to slam shut in her wake. Satisfied, Emily listened for a moment for any further evidence of movement on the other side of the stall door, and then settled back against the toilet wall, the snarl of her lips curving into a sly smile. The voice had spoken. It was back. It wasn't so bad. It was on her side. It knew where her heart lay. Control slid with such ease from her, comfortable and smooth. She placed her palms on the cool, dirty tiles and pushed up from the floor, letting swathes of the soft black material of her ball gown swish back into place from where she'd scrunched it up in her fury and desperation, so it pulled around her ankles as she stood. Emily cracked open the stool door to double-check the ladies' room was empty before she made her way to the wash-basin, reached for the lemongrass-scented liquid soap and pressed 2 squirts into her hand. She rubbed, watching every move as she cleaned thoroughly in between her fingers like she'd been taught, letting the suds turn white before she rinsed them off with water hot enough to scald the flesh from her bones. But she never flinched, never retreated. As she drew her gaze from her dripping hands to the mirror in front of her, plumes of steam fogged her image and made it waver in front of her, She stared into her own ice-blue eyes, starkly emphasized against the black mascara and eyeliner smeared down cheeks white as chalk. Recognition curved her lips. "Oh, Emily, what are you going to do?" Chapter 2. Saturday, the 10th of July, 23:55 hours. Jenna Morgan spread her bare arms wide across the back of the raffia furniture she'd taken delivery of earlier that day, and tipped her face to look up at the stars canvassing the clear sky over her back garden. The mere whisper of a breeze would be welcome, but despite the nightfall, temperatures soared, making for a sticky, overheated atmosphere and thick air that clung to her skin with wet persistence. The gentle buzz of alcohol melted her limbs and loosened her tongue as Domino, Fliss's Dalmatian, nudged his way onto the brand-new sofa cushion between herself and her sister. Soft sod. He circled around, then with a heartfelt groan as though he'd worked hard all day without a break, as she had, the dog settled in a tight ball, his arse rammed up against Jenna's thigh, with his head on Fliss's lap. Instead of the twinge of annoyance she would have felt a year ago at him worming his way onto her brand-new furniture, a warm glow spread its golden wings to melt her heart. Jenna moved her arm so her hand rested on Domino's black-spotted backside before she stroked the length of the raised scar that ran along his side. A scar he'd obtained the previous year when he'd taken on Fliss's kidnapper and come off worst in a fight with a large branch the attacker had wielded with force. He'd hit him hard enough so the dog had tumbled down a long, steep hillside in the Ironbridge gorge. Jenna sank her fingers into his satin fur. "I bloody love you." The words slipped in a haze from her mouth. Fliss's soft giggle told Jenna her sister had drunk enough too. Perhaps they should slip off to bed. If only she had the energy to move. "Who are you talking to?" Fliss's image wavered before Jenna's eyes. The daft Dalmatian. Who else? Fliss took a sip of her chilled Sauvignon Blanc and huffed out a breathy laugh. "Me?" Her head gave a drunken roll on her shoulders. "I know you do." Jenna laughed up at the stars, her world reeling in soft circles. It was time for bed. In a minute. "I do." She let her heavy head loll to one side so she could eye her sister. "What did you think of the people you've interviewed so far?" Fliss's smile stretched wide. "I haven't interviewed them. It was just a quick chat on the phone with a few people." "People who you intend carrying out a job for you." "Dog walking." "It's a job." "It is. And you interviewed people for the position." Laughter gurgled from her sister as she tipped her head back and shook her hair so it spilled over the back of the furniture. "Okay, you win. I spoke with 3. She shot Jenna a sly glance. "Interviewed 3. I wasn't keen on the first woman, Leslie. Nice enough, but she seemed too much about the business and not enough about the animals. The other 2 were really nice. Harvey and Jill. Harvey's coming around to meet Domino on Monday evening. I checked your schedule to make sure you're available. I'd rather you were there." Jenna checked her sister for signs of self-doubt, but saw none, just a keenness to involve Jenna on the decision. "It's a shame we need a dog walker at all, after the last one, but necessary." She scraped her fingernails over the top of his spine and enjoyed the appreciative groan he sent up. Fliss wriggled around and tucked her feet under her as she turned to face Jenna, wine glass cradled in one hand and the other stroking Domino. "Even without the court case coming up, he needs additional exercise when we're both working." "I agree. I've given Jill a couple of dates and she'll come back to me." "Good. Just let me know." Fliss murmured her assent as she took a drink of her wine, and a comfortable silence held in the thick night air for a moment. "It's been nice. Just the 2 of us." Jenna raised her glass and took a sip of the wine, surprised to find she'd almost finished the glass. Another glass. God, I haven't had this much to drink in an age. Nor me. Thank God I'm not at work tomorrow. 25 children would kill me. Haha, me too. I don't know how you do what you do. Jenna could have nothing but admiration for her younger sister, who worked as a teacher at Coalbrookdale and Ironbridge School. Same. Fliss's smile stretched across her face. The things Mason tells me makes my blood curdle. Jenna didn't tend to divulge too much about the grim side of her job to her younger sister, instead preferring to focus on positive matters. Was he okay about tonight? She referred to the fact that they were having an unusual girly night in without Fliss's boyfriend and Jenna's work partner, DC Mason Ellis. Yeah, no problem. Fliss stretched her long legs out in front of her and let out a soft groan. He wanted to visit his brother anyway. Have some family time. She rolled her head so she could look at Jenna. What about my Lord Adrian? Jenna grinned, a wide, silly grin, as Fliss referred to Jenna's relatively new boyfriend, Chief Crown Prosecutor Adrian Hall, who, a bit like Mason, spent more time at Jenna's house than his own these days. He's fine. Really busy. Plenty of work to catch up on his new case. What about tomorrow? He's coming over, but it's too hot to do anything. What about the beach? Abu Dhabi? Wales and its rugged coastline were less than an hour and a half's drive away. Too busy. Llandudno? Meh. It would be overwhelmingly hectic with such a lovely, long Victorian pier jutting out into the Irish Sea and the wide promenade which would be overrun with tourists. She wasn't in the mood for crowds. She saw enough of them at work. The unprecedented heat brought a deluge of criminals out of the woodwork. Flashes, domestic abuse, sexual predators. What about the West Shore beach? With its sand dunes and privacy, Llandudno's West Shore beach was much quieter. That would be good. Adrian and I can lie out in the sun and fry our skin for a few hours. Yeah, that might work. Jenna drained her glass. What about you? Do you have plans with Mason? He'll want to have monkey sex. Fliss gurgled out a wicked laugh at Jenna's flinch. For the love of Jesus, I've told you. I don't want to know anything about your sex life with Mason. I have to work with the man. I don't want that image in my head. I was teasing. Fliss's laughter floated on the warm night air. The scent of the jasmine Jenna had planted carried a headiness. We thought we might get up really early before the heat and take Domino over the Shropshire Hills. Back for brunch, and then Mason said he could do with popping into the station to get some paperwork done. Jenna nodded, relieved she didn't have to listen to a blow-by-blow account of Fliss's sex life with a man she considered to be almost a brother. With one last scrub at Domino's coat, Jenna pushed herself to her feet. Unsteady, she wobbled for a moment before she was able to put one foot in front of the other. I'm off. Are you coming? I am. Fliss reached a hand up, and Jenna closed her fingers around it and gave a hard yank. As Fliss lurched to her feet, Jenna steadied them both. Oh God, I'm going to regret this in the morning. Me too. Fliss swayed. At least you can have a lie-in. Mason said he'd be with me by 6 a.m. Message him. Tell him to come later. Fliss scraped a hand through her hair as she closed her eyes. Nah, it'll be fine. We'll have a nice walk, won't we, Domino? In all fairness, the dog raised his head for a brief moment before he lowered his chin back down to his paws, but his eyes remained open. Come on, boy. Time for bed. With a heartfelt groan, Domino slid from the soft cushion and ambled after Fliss as she wove her way up the garden to the house. Relieved he didn't follow her, Jenna closed the patio doors and locked them behind everyone. She had no idea how Fliss coped with his hot body pressed against hers on the bed, pinning the bedclothes tight around her. During winter she could understand it, but never in the middle of a heat wave. The cool shower did little to relieve her once she was dry, and the heat hit her again. Too hot, and midsummer, it was barely dark enough to sleep anyway. Jenna kicked the sheets back and sprawled naked on top of the bed, praying for a cool breeze to sneak through the open windows, thankful Domino had chosen to sleep on Fliss's bed with her. The world gave a gentle rotation as she closed her eyes and hoped for a peaceful, dreamless sleep. Chapter 3. Sunday, the 11th of July, 10:25 hours. Imelda Cheetham-Epstein smiled at her new husband of 3 weeks as he scratched his head. Lines of concentration etched into his face. He picked up the sander so he could skim the dirty green flaked paint from the original oak door before they decided whether to leave it naked, just treating it with oil, or whether they needed to paint it. It all depended on the quality beneath once he stripped the paint off. A smile split his face as he glanced up at her, placed the instrument down, and reached out to take Joshua from her arms. At 11 months old, their little boy was a bundle of full-on activity, which recently had tired her out quicker than expected. She touched her hand to her distended stomach and smiled back at Zack. Unplanned, the second pregnancy had taken them both by surprise. They'd wanted more children, but hadn't quite prepared themselves for another child hot on the heels of the first. She'd wanted to get married before they had Joshua, but she'd also not wanted to rush the preparations. By the time she'd planned their wedding, she was already pregnant with their second, and didn't see the point of bringing it forward. As neither one of them had been upset, it didn't matter. They loved each other. Already 28 weeks pregnant, the children would be extremely close in age by the time she gave birth. They'd be a handful, but it didn't bother her. She just needed a little extra sleep, which she'd already had that morning. Not that it had made any difference, as the heat swiped away any freshness she'd felt when she first woke. She lifted the thick swathe of hair from her neck and considered putting it up in a ponytail. "I was going to make brunch. Are you ready?" Zack kissed the top of Joshua's head and grinned as his son reached out with chubby fingers to tug at Zack's lips. He blew a raspberry while he nodded at her. "I'm starving." He was always starving. A long, skinny streak of a man, never still, he ate up his energy and sucked in calories to fuel himself. "Full cooked?" It was a Sunday treat. She wasn't sure she could manage sausage, bacon, eggs, baked beans and mushrooms, but she might throw a bacon butty together for herself and watch Zack inhale his food. "That would be great." With a smile at her little boy, she reached her arms out to take Joshua back. 15 minutes, Zack. No longer. 15 minutes, and I'll have a full English ready for you. Keep up your strength." She broke into a grin as she balanced Joshua and stretched out, her fingers small against Zack's skin as she took a squeeze of his muscles and made him laugh. "I'll see if he'll go down for a nap. He's been full of himself this morning. Perhaps we'll take him down to Dale End Park later this afternoon, let him run off some energy." It would give Zack a break from DIY too. Lined with ancient old trees with the River Severn idling its way through it at this time of year, Dale End Park, seated in the Ironbridge Gorge, provided a wide expanse of shade and a vast enough area for a toddler to wear himself out. The little park would more than likely be full of other small children, but it didn't matter. There was plenty of wide open space, and the tree-lined football field would have very few people after practice finished around midday. She could only hope to catch the soft breezes that meandered through the valley in the wake of the river. Imelda took hold of Joshua and adjusted him, so he sat on her hip. Not sure how much longer she would be able to lift him, she buried her face against thick hair, the same as his father's, as he wrapped his arms around her neck and cooed at her. A flicker of worry ran over Zack's face as she looked up. "Can you manage?" He placed a soft kiss on the end of her nose. "Yes, of course." She dismissed his concern, while at the same time her heart gave a little hitch. She was stronger than her new husband believed, but his thoughtfulness warmed her heart. Already on his feet at the age of 11 months, Joshua was still unsteady, and Imelda preferred to carry him down the 2 flights of stairs and then let him go at the bottom. At the stage where he toddled at breakneck speed with no particular finesse or direction, he'd already given her several heart-stopping moments. Nappies had more than one use, and the number of times he'd landed on his backside, Imelda could only be thankful for the amount of padding those nappies provided. She held on to Joshua with one hand, balancing him on her hip as she gripped the banister with her other hand, cautious as she came down the flight of stairs to the first-floor landing as Zack turned on the sander and the shriek of it filled her ears. With a quick glance upstairs, she winced at the whine of the electrical equipment, and then turned towards Joshua's bedroom as her son's arms and legs flailed to show how full of energy he still was. Imelda sighed and hitched Joshua higher. There was no hope he'd take a snooze while activity and noise filled the house. He was too darned nosy. She'd do just as well to take him down with her and entertain him until Zack was ready to eat and they had some respite from the scream of the sander. Imelda made her way down the stairs, her fluffy socks protecting the soles of her feet from the broken tiles on the hallway floor. That would be their next project, hopefully done in time before their newest addition put in an appearance. Imelda bumped open the door to the kitchen with her hip and let it swing shut behind them to close out the loud intrusion of the sander, while she grabbed the remote to switch on the small TV. The cheery beat of Paw Patrol filled the room. As Joshua kicked his legs in his enthusiasm to be set free, Imelda bent low and let him go. A wide smile spread over her face as he staggered like a drunkard over to the small box of wooden toys and snatched up his favourite train. She pulled open the fridge door and stared at the contents, then reached inside to take out a packet of bacon, while Joshua chunted in unintelligible delight to his toy. She placed her hand on her stomach, pleasure spreading a warmth through her as the baby kicked. There was no better way to spend her Sunday than at home with her boys. Chapter 4. Sunday the 11th of July, 10:35 hours. There was no giveaway sign to indicate anyone was even at home. The curtains were open, but the windows appeared blank. Emily shifted in her seat. 3 hours was a hell of a long time, longer than she'd previously spent watching from the sanctuary of her little white Honda Jazz. Although the car windows were down, not even a whisper of a breeze could tease its way through to cool her overheated flesh. The heat wave was killing her, killing everyone. It had flashed in with a suddenness that had rocked the country. The shift in the jet stream was held accountable. Global warming. Whatever the reason, it was like sinking into the pits of hell. A trickle of sweat meandered its way down the length of her spine until she plucked her white cotton shirt from her skin. She regretted the decision to wear heavy jeans, but she'd wanted to show off the length of her legs, the curve of her hips. The white shirt was nipped in at the waist and emphasized the generous bosom she'd always been proud of, a bosom which had expanded in the last year or so. Zack had liked her breasts. He'd always told her it was her best feature. They were fuller now, more rounded. He couldn't be anything but impressed. She stared up at the tall facade of the building, narrowing her eyes as she inspected each window, waiting for a trace of movement somewhere behind the panes of glass. Zack was there. She knew he was home. There was his sleek black Audi, street-parked not far from the house. She'd have thought he'd have updated it by now. It was the same car he'd had when he first started his new job. That had to be almost 2 years ago. Still, it was a nice car. She dabbed her fingers at the thin line of sweat on her top lip and turned her head away from the car to study where he lived. The 3-story double-frontage Victorian house with a central front door seemed narrow at the front and went deep, appearing to overhang the valley below. She'd never seen the rear of the premises, but imagined a wooden balcony surrounded by an elegant balustrade with an unrestricted view of the valley that dropped into a steep slope of lush vegetation down to the River Severn. A slow smile spread over her face. When she lived there, she would trail an abundance of brightly coloured flowers, so they bloused over the balcony in great waterfalls. Petunias in elegant skirts of purples and reds, or begonias in bright splashes of orange and yellow. She pulled herself back from the drift of her imagination, and with narrowed eyes scanned the house again. Unsurprised by the lack of any movement on a Sunday morning, she shifted in her seat, sweat slicking her clothes to her, the shirt wet where it squeezed tight under her armpits. She swiped the back of her hand across her sticky cheek and dabbed at her forehead. Her memory of long, lazy Sunday mornings with Zack sent a mellow warmth curling through her chest until the stab of dark envy chased it away. It was no longer her and him in their cosy little flat. He was there, in the big house with his new wife. Emily's lips tightened over clenched teeth. A new wife. A wife he should never have married. He was supposed to be hers. She'd waited for him. He knew she'd waited, and yet still he'd married someone else. Heat circled deep in her belly as anger clutched at her throat. To push back the anger, she sucked in a deep breath. As she'd been taught, she closed her mind off from the distasteful, the murky evil that clawed at her. But the voice persevered in its subtle insistent. She's there. With him. It nudged into her consciousness. He's yours, not hers. It should be you, not her. You can take him back. Unable to ignore the voice, she chose instead to concentrate on the house. From the outside, it appeared he'd achieved so much more than she'd imagined possible. Since the last drive-by she'd made months before, he'd had the bricks sandblasted, taking off the thick coating of coal dust that had built up over the years as the trundle of coal carts wound their way through the Ironbridge gorge to the power station. Long since defunct, the machinations of the Industrial Revolution had nonetheless left their dirty footprints on the surrounding area. She sighed out a long breath. Perhaps his home would suit her. Once he'd achieved all he needed to in order to make it livable. She cast a look over the building again. It certainly looked hospitable. And big. Such a large property. She'd not realised before. A smile curved her lips, and she crossed her arms over her chest, settling back to let her imagination take her on a long, meandering wander through their future life, once he'd shuffled his current wife along. She was a mistake. He'd know it soon enough. As soon as he saw her again, he'd realise his mistake. There was only one woman for him, one woman who had what it took to keep his attention. Her breath caught in her throat as a shadow flitted past the frosted window of the front door. The slow pump of her heart turned to a race as she sprang upright to stare harder until her eyes dried and stung through lack of blinking. Not allowing herself enough time to collect her thoughts, she reached out to flip the handle of the door and push it open. She stepped out of the car, keys in the tight grip of her fist, with no consideration of the windows she'd left down. With a heavy throb in the base of her throat, spikes of anticipation crawled over her skin and sent another wave of heat to blast her skin and tingle the pulse points at the back of her knees. Go and get him. The soft whisper of it echoed in her mind. He's yours, not hers. She nodded to acknowledge the truth of it. Go and get him. Take back what is rightfully yours. The sheer thrill of seeing him again gave her the confidence to stride straight up to the little old pitch fencing gate that needed tending to and swing it open. The moment he saw her, he'd know. She was sure of it. Her white sneakers kept her footsteps silent as she strode the short length of the crazy paving path to the sage-green painted front door and pressed the bell, its old-fashioned ring barely discernible above the screeching buzz of a power tool coming from inside the house. She'd not noticed the noise from her car, with music playing low on her iPod. The watery shadow of someone approaching filled the small square of thick frosted window and shot her pulse into an erratic rhythm of nerves. She reached up to run her fingers through the length of her straight blonde hair. What would she say? Tell him everything. Tell him how you feel, how sorry you are, how much you love him. He'll understand. He'll know the truth of it the moment he sees you again. Why wouldn't he? The hoarse whisper instilled her with the conviction that wavered for a short moment. The little woman who swung the door open made the words Emily had ready to pour forth stick in her throat, as her jaw dropped to leave her open-mouthed and speechless. Nothing like she'd expected. Petite, delicate, much younger than Zack, stunningly beautiful with big brown eyes brimming with happiness and a face flushed with pleasure. "That happiness should be yours," the voice sneered at her, its disgust a slithering darkness in her stomach. "She snatched away your happiness, your future. Are you going to allow it?" The young woman raised her chin to look up at her, her perfectly plump lips tilted up at the edges in a friendly smile. "Hello." In the silence, the woman's lips quivered uncertainly before the smile fell away. "Can I help you?" Emily battened down on the spike of fury that refused to be completely contained. It simmered away while she assessed her adversary, narrowing her eyes to take in the skinny, flat-chested woman whose head barely reached Emily's chin. She stretched her lips in a wide smile, bright enough to chase away the shimmer of doubt that lurked for a brief flicker of time in the other woman's eyes. "Is Zack home?" "Zack?" The woman's gaze skittered skyward to above where the noise came from before it settled back on her. "He's busy. Can I help? I'm Imelda." She grinned with over-exaggerated delight. "His wife." "His new wife, the conceited bitch. How dare she flaunt her fortune in your face?" Emily tilted her head to one side, flickered her gaze down to take in the prissy gingham tea-towel Imelda clutched against the distinct rounded bump of her belly. Fire raced over Emily's skin to shoot up her neck and into her face in a blaze of fury. "His wife!" the voice shrieked in her mind, setting her teeth on edge. "The little bitch is pregnant!" "No!" The voice burst from her constricted throat in a threatening growl, deep and feral. Sly and insidious, the voice grated in her ear. "That's how she got him. She tricked him. He'll know. The moment he sees you, he'll know what a mistake he made. You just need him to see you. Make her get him." Emily breathed in through her nose and towered above the slighter woman. "I said I want Zack." Imelda's long black lashes fluttered over deep brown eyes filled with shocked uncertainty as she took a step back. Her lips popped open as she reached out with one delicate hand for the door. Emily clenched her teeth against the rise in fury as instinct kicked in and she snatched at the smaller woman's hand before Imelda could swing the door closed against her. Grasped it in her much larger one, she gave her fingers a squeeze. "Got her. You've got her now." The voice breathed its encouragement. The jolt of pleasure warmed her insides at the fear churning through the other woman's expression. She placed one foot inside the hallway and leaned in closer. "I want Zack." She couldn't make it clearer. "What does the woman expect? He belongs to you, not Imelda." The soft purr filled her with conviction. "Get him for me now." She didn't need to raise her voice. It was deep, clear, and there could be no misunderstanding. Imelda twisted her hand around, but failed to prise her slender wrist from Emily's hard grasp. She took another step back, and Emily followed her into the hallway as it widened out into a neat little square of cracked and broken red checkerboard Victorian tiles. "Get out!" Imelda's eyes widened with panic. "Get out of our house!" Imelda yanked at her wrist, but Emily held firm, determination and focus in her grip. Recognition flashed over Imelda's features. "I know who you are." The dark thrill of the other woman's fear kicked Emily's adrenaline up, sending her heart into a fast, uneven rhythm to overpower the small wash of drugs her body still retained. "I know you." Imelda jerked her head back, the edges of her faded smile turned downwards. She made a quick scan from head to foot. Annoyance replaced the fear in her gaze, and instead of backing away, she took a step forward to bring their faces close together as she peered up into Emily's eyes. "Zack told me all about you when we first met. All about you. And no, you can't see him. You need to leave. Right now, before I call the police." In the face of the other woman's anger, fury whipped up without warning, and Emily let out the pained yowl of an injured animal as the sound of the electric tool vibrated through the house, filling her head with white noise. A noise she was all too familiar with. Too late, Imelda realised her mistake in provoking Emily, and the bravery washed away, to be replaced with terror, as she stepped further back into her hallway, her wrist still in the firm vice of Emily's fingers. A red haze blanketed Emily's vision. She tightened her fingers around her car keys, raised her hand, and with one hard jerk, she had Imelda stumbling forward as she slashed at her face. Dark satisfaction throbbed through her veins as the other woman's skin unzipped and scarlet bloomed to run from the thin gash on her cheek down the side of her neck. Her distressed cry was little more than a squeak as Imelda whipped her hand to her cheek, shock streaking over her face as she removed her blood-streaked fingers to stare at them. Imelda teetered backwards, her petite body no real measure for the power of vibrating fury. Filled with unsatisfied bloodlust, Emily's fist connected with Imelda's face once more, vicious and focused, all semblance of sanity evaporating in the crimson cloud of rage. She punched a third time and caught the woman on the end of her chin and grinned as Imelda went down. Not an elegant crumple to her knees, but a poleaxe. The wet smack of Imelda's head as it made contact with the tiles would have made a lesser heart contract. But too intent, too focused on the woman who had stolen her soulmate, Emily never flinched. Flat on the floor, Imelda's delicate body prone, the gentle bulge in her stomach drew Emily's gaze. Incensed, rage boiled in a seething lava. "Get her!" the voice roared in her head. Unleashed, her temper erupted, and she launched herself on top of Imelda, her knees either side of the woman's bloated belly. She grabbed at the perfect chestnut locks and heaved the woman's head up until their noses almost touched, then slammed it down onto the hard surface. Smack! Smack! The thud of it roiled around in Emily's stomach to give her nothing but satisfaction, while the electric thrum from upstairs filled her mind to spur her on. Silence dropped like a white blanket over the house as the whine and drone from the electric equipment overhead cut off to leave the distant throb of Jordan North's BBC One jingle drifting from upstairs. Emily raised her head, breath soughing through her chest as she unravelled the thick hair from around her fingers. Her lips curled with distaste as she flicked off strands she'd ripped from Imelda's scalp. Through eyes cleared of the raging hatred, she rested back on her heels, her backside on Imelda's skinny thighs. Unsure, confusion stuttered through her at the scene. Slicked with sweat, her blood-stained keys rattled in her sticky fingers as she raised her hands to her cheeks, her voice hushed and rusty. "What have you done? Oh, Emily, what have you done?" With no reply from the voice, she held her breath and waited. Where was it? Where was the support when she needed it most? Her gaze focused on Imelda's face as the slow spread of blood pooled out from around the woman's head and drizzled from the gash on her cheek. Brown eyes wide, blank, and staring up at the ceiling, frozen in death. "Oh, you've killed her, Emily. What have you done now? You've killed her." She raised a trembling hand and covered her mouth, numb to everything, as her world ground to a standstill to leave her in a vacuum of her own making. She tilted her head to one side and held her breath. The vague strumming of a child's song filtered through her consciousness to make the hairs on the back of her neck give a warning tingle as she became aware of another presence. Heart pounding so loud all other noise was blocked out, she turned her head in slow motion, her fingers gripping tight to the car keys, her one grasp on reality. Her lips parted as the weight of her jaw pulled down and her mouth dropped open. Her breath stuttered out in faltering little puffs as her attention centered on the intent gaze pinning her in place. As the plump-cheeked child stumbled forward with the awkward, drunken motion of someone who has just learnt to walk, Emily's breath came back in a rush of heart-rending love. Dark curls tight to its head, violet eyes, so like its father's, were instantly recognisable. Emily's heart soared as the child slipped its forefinger from between plump, wet lips and stared her straight in the eye. "Mama?" Chapter 5. Sunday the 11th of July, 11:10 hours. Damn, but it was hot. Detective Sergeant Jenna Morgan dabbed a bead of sweat from her top lip and then flopped her forehead onto her arms, where they rested on her desk in Malinsgate Police Station. Some cheeky sod had whipped her fan from her office for their own relief from the overwhelming heat. If only they had CCTV, she'd find out who the culprit was and whip their ass for them. Overheated, she shuffled her backside in her chair. She needed to buy herself some new black trousers. She'd yanked on her winter ones in the blur of her rush that morning. Far too warm for the current weather, but who the hell knew they were about to have a heatwave of epic proportions with the suddenness of a desert storm? She blew out a breath designed to cool herself, but all it achieved was to make her fringe flutter above her damp forehead for a moment before it settled back to stick to her skin. Plain clothes she may be, but black trousers were the unofficial uniform for her and most of the other officers. She very rarely wore anything else. If her head hadn't hurt so much, she may well have made a different choice. One she'd not have regretted. A good-fitting pair of black trousers were smart, practical, and should the need arise, they never showed the blood or urine stains if she happened to get into a tussle with a suspect. Puke was a different matter, but who could live with the smell of that for more than 5 minutes in any case? In her position, she'd not been puked on for a number of years now, but the chances of it still made her think twice about her clothing choices. From a purely practical side, although she rarely got in a fight these days, when she did, she didn't want her knickers on display by wearing a skirt. She rolled her forehead from side to side, the thin film of sweat rubbed off on her cooler forearm as she huffed out a breath. The temperature had kicked up with unexpected suddenness, sending the whole country into a heatwave. And here she was, on her supposed day off, having to come in to cover for DS lazy-ass Stevens' shift in a compact office where the aircon had given up the ghost and no one could fix it until Monday at the earliest. No surprise Stevens had called in sick yet again on his allocated Sunday. The man hadn't completed a full shift since he'd remarried earlier that year, evidently preferring a 9-to-5 job. The call at 6:05 that morning had done little to endear him to her. Her head, still fuzzy from the bottle of wine she'd consumed, stayed that way despite taking another cold shower and inhaling a single piece of toast before she dashed out of the door, travel mug full of coffee in hand. She felt like shit. She'd probably feel like shit for the rest of the day, or at least until she finished at 6 p.m. Jenna raised her head and pressed her fingertips into her eyelids. She leaned to one side and peered through her open door into the main office. Quiet on a Sunday morning, barely even hushed voices as officers sat at their computers, taking advantage of the time to process the paperwork that got sidelined during the week when they were busier. From what Fliss had told her, she'd most likely see Mason later, and possibly Ryan catching up on paperwork, but currently none of the people on duty were in her team. The last of the Saturday night revellers had already been roused, interviewed or cautioned, processed and sent home. The most awkward was the old gentleman who'd recently lost his wife and thought that dropping his pants in public was quite acceptable. A telephone call to his daughter had set the cat amongst the pigeons. She was horrified, threatened to put him in a home. Not that a home would do the poor old guy any favours. He wasn't sick, just horribly lonely and very sad, not understanding what he was supposed to do now his wife of 57 years was gone. His kingpin, his anchor. Jenna tapped the screen of her iPhone and stared at the time, 11:38. At least she was on an early. She'd be off by 6 p.m. She'd possibly just go home and lie in the back garden with a cool glass of Pinot Grigio and a packet of Walker's crisps. Recovery. She'd let the early evening sun beat down on her while Adrian read his papers in preparation for a court case the following week. Birmingham-based, Much of his time since they'd known each other had been taken up by a major case in London. Still ongoing, it divided his time. Time with him she'd come to appreciate more and more. Time she should have spent with him today at the beach. It was a good job the man was understanding. Something inside her warmed each time her sexy chief crown prosecutor came to mind. And he was hers now. Not that she was possessive, but they'd established their relationship. They were exclusive. They'd only known each other for 9 months, but from the first moment they'd met, there'd been an instant bond. Not a simple attraction, but something much deeper, possibly connected with the situation. With her own sister's disappearance, Adrian had lent Jenna not